And awesome. So we're recording. So Laura, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, definitely. So hi everyone, it's nice to meet you. My name's Laura Wang. My background is in climate and energy policy, and then about 2 years ago, I transitioned to a full-time PM role. I work currently at a small, we're about 35 people size startup based out of San Francisco with offices in other states as well. And we focus on distributed energy resources. So that means customer-sided resources like PV, battery storage, electric vehicles that feed back to the grid. And we primarily work on how do you plan and optimize and accurately value the behavior of those resources to all of the stakeholders. And I originally have a background, like I said, in public policy. And so I think, I don't know everyone's backgrounds, but I hope it is kind of interesting to hear how I got to where I am, and folks who are interested in both, hopefully it's an interesting conversation as well to hear how the skills could potentially be applicable. Because I do think, the role of a PM is in those skill sets are not so different than ones that are really important when you're making policy-based decisions.
Yeah, that's an incredible segue actually to my next question, which is how did your climate journey start actually?
Yeah, good question. So I think like a lot of folks who are in the work on climate group, I am hugely interested in the outdoors growing up. We took a lot of family vacations hiking, going to national parks. And then I was pretty science focused in high school, and actually worked on a project to conduct energy efficiency audits in classrooms. We set up this program so that classrooms and teachers could kind of compete with one another to lower their carbon emissions through these EE audits. It was actually kind of picked up as a formal program by our school district and our local utility, and then the National Wildlife Foundation expanded it into a national program, which was really cool. And through that project, we got awarded this national level EPA award, and they flew us to the White House to do the ceremony in the Rose Garden. I got to meet George Bush, which was, I wouldn't say he's my favorite president, but it's very interesting when you're 16 to meet a president. And it was just a really interesting experience. And I think for me, it probably instilled a lot of this naive optimism, potentially naive optimism about the capacity for change and how quickly things could potentially move in the climate sector. I don't think that assumption has held throughout my career, but it was a really kind of nice foot to start on, because it really was, this idea we just had as high schoolers that expanded into this national program.
That is very cool to hear. And it seems that your climate change journey started in high school, which is a lot earlier than a lot of us. So, but what makes you decided to choose climate change public policy in particular instead of the other fields?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I, like I said, was pretty science focused in high school, and then college did an environmental studies degree. And I focused on marine and coastal conservation in my graduate program. And I think all throughout college and thinking about what I wanted to do next, I thought a lot about what my theory of change was, or how I could, as an individual, make the most impact on an incredibly complex topic. And I think that's something a lot of folks who work in the climate sector think about. It's a very overwhelming topic. It can feel a little bit defeatist before you even really start. For me, I wanted to think about how my skills kind of best line up with what the problem areas were and what were the biggest problems I could potentially tackle. I figured that I had pretty good soft skills, and I started having some interest in law school. So the best advice I had really gotten was to, take the most interesting opportunity you get, not necessarily the best paying one. And so my first move right out of college was an internship at the White House. I also really wanted to live in DC, so it was nice that kind of lined up. Spent some time there and then moved back to Sacramento to work for Governor Jerry Brown, who's the former governor of California, to work on his climate and energy team. I think that was probably like the best early career public policy job I ever could have asked for. I was able to work kind of directly with the governor's senior advisors, work on these large initiatives and executive orders, and pull together the right stakeholders, ask a lot of strategic questions. When you call someone pretty high level and say you're from the governor's office, they usually like pretty quick to respond. And so it was really neat working with stakeholders at that high of a level who are interested in working with us. And I ended up working on a lot of initiatives I'm still really, really proud of. We worked on vehicle electrification, even back then, zero net energy homes, cap and trade policy, and environmental justice issues. And I worked on fracking a little bit as well. I think I am a pretty good multitasker and know how to balance priorities, and that this experience in a very like high pressure, fast-paced environment really proved that to me. And I've learned obviously later in life too that those are very useful skill sets as a product manager as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think following the like I said, for me, I really was trying to figure out where I could be of most impact, and California did kind of feel like the right place at that time. As I'm sure a lot of people know, California is, I think, the 7th largest economy in the world, or was at that time, and so has a huge impact on national and international climate and energy policy. We used to say a lot, where California goes, so goes the nation, which is very, very California centric. But it is really true in terms of climate and energy policy. Historically, California set cap and trade policy, which other states in the Northeast follow. We also set vehicle emission standards, where national standards start following the California standards. It felt like a place where I could have a lot of agency to make change. At the same time, I remember still kind of getting a little bit discouraged about the pace we're moving, which was really fast, and yet you're still waiting kind of years for something to happen. And as well, California is, being such a big economy, didn't have really a say on the global scale. And as many folks know, we really do need like international commitments in place to meet the very ambitious 2030, 2045 targets in 2-degree to prevent the 2-degree warming that we know is potentially coming. And so, for me as well, I was thinking maybe I could potentially make even greater change if I worked on international climate policy and worked in developing countries. It can't be that difficult to like come to an international agreement. Like I don't know why it's not happening. So maybe I can work there and try to make that a goal of my career. So I ended up going back to DC to work in international climate policy at a nonprofit called Center for Clean Air Policy. And I spent actually a year as well in Samoa on a Fulbright scholarship. So I was working directly with that island nation to prepare for the Paris COP negotiations in 2015. Definitely for least developed countries and for small island developing states, they are really dependent on international aid, and they're the most vulnerable to climate change impacts. But they are the least supported when it comes to participating in the negotiations, and also have the least ability, honestly, to slow down the problem. Like they're by far the least contributors, but will be the most impacted by sea level rise, increased warming, increased natural disasters. And then kind of ultimately, there are a lot of other issues with international development as a field. It's really slow and complex, even more so than like state and national policy. And there's a lot of mismatched incentives due to the way funding works for projects. And realistically, I did end up getting a little bit jaded, and so ended up kind of coming back to the States. Yeah, I think that's kind of generally why and how I pursued climate change public policy.
Awesome. Yeah. And so I wonder, like, throughout these years in your early career in public policy, what were your biggest learning?
Yeah, biggest learnings, I think, for me, it really was to like stop chasing this perfect theory of change. It makes a lot more sense looking back to just kind of like pick one and like devote your time and energy to it, and know and hopefully believe that there's a lot of other like very talented people working on this problem from other angles. Like no one person can solve everything, right? And it's I think because the problem is so overwhelming, you know, kind of growing up, I just felt like I had to try a little bit of everything to figure out like where do you stop the leaking holes in the boat, and it doesn't really work that way. It's, you know, I look back and think like I probably should have just kind of focused my energy on one problem, like dug deep, not broad, and but at the same time, I had a lot of experiences I don't regret having. But I think that was probably my biggest learning. And then, you know, ultimately as well, I think, and I've mentioned it a few times, working in public policy does require you to accept like slow moving change. You're going to kind of, you're going to make incremental progress, and at the same time that incremental progress could be wiped out at any second. Like ultimately with the 2016 elections, we essentially erased, you know, multiple years of climate progress, and that is really discouraging, and it takes certain types of people to be able to work in that environment and, you know, kind of keep going. And ultimately I decided it really wasn't for me.
The theory of change learning is actually really helpful, because I'm making my own one, and it's really helpful to kind of like see people's experiences as they recall back. You mentioned also, you know, you worked at the Center for the Center for Clean Air Policy, where you were working on international relations, international development, and federal policy, basically. What inspired you to kind of like go sort of state policy to Gridworks? And if you could also explain what Gridworks is to the audience.
Yeah, definitely. So Gridworks is a policy nonprofit based in Oakland, California. And I worked there for 2 years when I transitioned back to California after my Fulbright. What I found most interesting working in Samoa was how energy systems look for small island developing states. In Samoa, they import about 60% of their energy, and it's very super dirty oil that comes in on tankers from Indonesia. They are an island system. They potentially have the capacity to be self-reliant. And so I worked a lot on distributed energy resources and microgrids development there. California, you know, speaking of California kind of being the technology leader, and as California goes, so goes the nation. California right now, or at the time, was the leader in thinking about distributed energy resources. And it's worked in the past as well. California kind of like single-handedly pushed down that technology adoption curve to make to make electric vehicles cheaper, to have more people adopt PV. So I thought it'd be a really interesting place to work. At that time, a lot of the focus of that nonprofit was working with stakeholders to understand all of the ways that DER will reshape our grid system, how it changes how we interact with energy, and how the big players like utilities and regulators need to plan for and prepare for those changes. And another thing to think about is valuation. So if you are providing grid services by owning a Tesla Powerwall at your home, what is the right incentive level, or what do you actually get paid for those grid services? And at the same time, how does the regulator or utility know that you will provide those services when they're called upon? Really interesting questions. I think what I kind of learned about that time in my career is that on the regulation and policy side, people are always recommending technology change and specifying actually technology requirements. Like in this role, we talked all the time about needing a data platform that could help us with a lot of this. For me, it was, well, we've been talking about it for a while. We don't know who the vendor would be. We don't really know how it would work. And the job I'm at now, Kabala, to me, it sounded like, well, this is kind of the solution we've been talking about for years on the policy level that we need to enable this transformative change on the energy system.
So before we get into Kabala, you were, the kind of like the greatest benefit that you found when working at Gridworks was kind of, just to kind of summarize what you're saying, is you've learned specific skills, but you also got closer to the problem. So you were able to work closer to the stakeholders, right?
Exactly.
Right. And so having said that, why did you decide to leave, and how did you come to that decision when you were working so close to the problem?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, like I was saying, I think working really close to the problem means that you are closer to the ear of those people making the decisions. And that is a really good place to be. At the same time, at the regulatory level, you can really kind of get caught up in your own, what is the saying? Like you get caught between the spokes of the wheel. It's very easy to kind of get tangled up in making the problem too large and complex. Because I was working a lot with stakeholders, we were actually talking to a lot of really cool companies, providing technology solutions and thinking innovatively. And there are a lot of opportunities to innovate. The challenge is that energy is a regulated sector. And so if you are like a demand response provider, for example, looking to get paid for the service you're providing, it all depends on the rules that have been established by the regulators. And so for that technology company, they need to be in those meetings when they're talking about how you should formulate the rules and how you baseline and decide how you get paid for the action you're performing. And we at the time, Gridworks worked out of this clean tech incubator in Oakland called Powerhouse, and I met a lot of interesting technology companies that said, like, look, these conversations are all valuable, and it's where we need to be involved in to make sure there's a space in the market for the technology solution we're trying to provide. But it's a ton of work. It's really hard to stay engaged, and ultimately we're not sure if it's worth that time and value for us. So for me, it was kind of interesting thinking like, well, I find the solutions really interesting. I am really plugged in already to the policy side. So why not try to like make the best of both of those interests and work directly for a technology company?
For sure, that totally makes sense. And talking about Kevala, your current startup, could you tell us a bit more about what is Kevala and why did you choose to join Kevala out of all the other startups?
Yeah, definitely. So Kevala is a startup kind of focused on energy, data, and analytics that we try to provide insight about the electricity grid and what happens as you adopt more DERs. I joined when we were a team of about like 9 people or so, and we were working out of this old Victorian house in the Lower Haight in San Francisco. And now we're a team of like 35 people. So that's been really exciting. Kevala's we have a lot of different users in the sector, including solar and storage developers, regulators and utilities, EV OEMs, and CCAs, or community choice aggregators, who I think they're the most popular probably in California. You know, as you guys know now, I didn't come from a technical background, but the role I started in it was very interdisciplinary. I interfaced with clients a lot and started communicating requirements from those clients to our development team. And more so just kind of started becoming embedded into more of a product role. Before we had any product managers on the team. And so I was kind of quasi playing that role for a while before I realized, like, hey, what I'm doing is not like project management necessarily, it's product management. And that kind of sparked my interest into understanding more what are the exact roles that a product manager works on, and whether would be something I would be good at or not.
For sure. And speaking of PM, what do you do as a product manager on your day-to-day job? And what are some of your main challenges you face at Kevala?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think with like a lot of PM jobs, there's no such thing as like a typical day, but generally what I do focus on is our long-term strategic roadmap, near-term product roadmap, so on like more of a quarterly basis. I still work quite a bit with client engagement on our ongoing project commitments, understanding what their requirements and pain points are. I work with our sales team on customer feedback and feature requests. And I work with our business development team in writing and developing proposals for new partnerships. We've been, like I mentioned, rapidly growing. So I'm also working a lot on what are our long-term goals and how do we develop a product strategy that gets us to where we want to go. And then, you know, kind of on some of the more regular tasks are, you know, sprint planning, engaging in retros, developing epics, writing tickets, writing requirements. So I really do a little bit of everything. We have one pretty mature SaaS product in the market where we think we've captured about 60 to 70% of the market there. And then we are working on a much more complex question, which probably is one of my biggest challenges, that really has to deal with, you know, a lot of the questions I was thinking about while at Gridworks. I love the mission of our company. We are focused on rapid decarbonization to fight climate change, because of the complexity of that problem and the relative newness of stakeholders engaging in these questions about DERs. Trying to solve that requires, like, one, a pretty deep understanding of the policy context, to the ability to work with these like very complex stakeholders. Our main clients there are regulators and utilities who have these like incredibly long lead times for software adoption. It kind of takes forever to get anything to contract, but they are the ones that are going to be making those decisions on how we use resources, like where will the EVs go? Will we build the chargers, or will third parties build the chargers? Like, they are the ones making those decisions. And so to work with them, you kind of have to put up with these, very complicated clients. And then their pain points are often, multiple, many, and kind of go across multiple departments. So taking EV chargers as an example, right? That crosses, for us, with the client we're working with right now, that crosses their new business strategy team, their interconnection team, their distribution capacity planning team, and their regulatory strategy team. And so you can't kind of just go in with your user interview and expect very, very straightforward answers. So, because I think that probably is one of the biggest challenges in the role, to be honest. At the same time, I'm glad we are playing that part. I think it's probably it would be naive on our part to think that we should just put a solution out there and expect utilities and regulators to adopt it. And understandably, these organizations should take a long time to make these decisions because they are wide sweeping and can have pretty big impacts. A great example is last year in, I'm going to use California again as an example, but last year in California with the wildfires, and we had to call these mandatory public safety power shutoff events that could be due to a whole host of issues. We could have incorrectly forecasted how much energy we needed. We could have had fewer resources show up when we needed them to show up. Understanding the root cause and how you could better solve for the problem next time have really big consequences. And so I'm glad folks in our that we work with do take time, but it is at the same time, it makes them a little harder to work with.
For sure. So following up on that, you mentioned that you're dealing with very complicated clients. What advice do you have for someone who will be dealing with complicated clients, and how did you manage that?
Yeah, I think for us, it really is patience, doing multiple user interviews, and really understanding when you can the kind of org chart of a company. What we've learned a lot from our utility clients is, they don't really talk to each other as much in the company as you might think they would. And so you almost have to kind of be not a puppet master, but you do have to kind of do some negotiating to make sure you're talking to the right people. And there's definitely a balance between making sure your requirements are right and giving enough time and structure to your development team so that they have something to start with. That can be really challenging. The other, I think, I've kind of taken on in the product role to kind of shield our development team from needing to understand the complexities of the energy policy realm. But that means I have to be very certain when I outline, the project I'm working on, the initiatives or the epics, that they're the right ones. Because I don't expect them to know all of the regulatory change going on.
I can't see Iris. Is Iris here?
Okay,
I'll ask.
My internet just got cut off. I'm sorry. Yeah. So, what does climate change mean to you at your job, and how do you measure your impact?
Yeah, I think one of the big questions in our industry is, basically no one knows yet what the right solution is to address grid decarbonization. we could move to a very decentralized model. At the other side, a lot of people advocate for like a national transmission grid. And I have thoughts, but no one really knows which is the right answer. And we shouldn't spend money on both because we would end up risking like gold plating the grid. And what I like about our organization is we're not trying to necessarily be the people coming up with the answers, but providing a platform and a framework for the stakeholders to actually accurately evaluate their options and make the right decision. And because we are, I think, working with stakeholders who want to make those decisions, right now, the way I'm kind of measuring it is kind of doing that check of, are the new engagements we're taking on in line with our company ethos and mission? Are they similarly focused on the same decarbonization goals we have? And the best way to measure that right now is kind of successful adoption and use of our product. That's kind of how we're measuring it right now. Again, those are kind of like long-term milestones, so it is challenging to measure. And for me, because I come from both like an adaptation and mitigation background, sometimes I wish we were doing something or a little bit more on the adaptation side. But for now, that's kind of our metric. Are we taking on projects that are in line with our ethos?
Thank you for sharing that. Obviously, like, you're growing your team so that you can, I guess, solve, like, basically learn about what the market needs and figure out, if this is the right solution so that you can craft what Kevala can offer. Before many people who joined this conversation, Laura was just talking about, as they were growing, there's like growing pains, and like as you're hiring new PMs, could you talk to us a little bit more about what do you look for when you're hiring PMs? Maybe you can just, a few people have mentioned in the chat that they're looking into getting into this space. Could you just talk a little bit more about what do you look for when you hire sort of like junior PMs or even mid-tier PMs?
Yeah, definitely. So right now we're kind of in the process of hiring to some different product roles. We're looking for someone with a really strong SaaS background. We're looking for some people with really good technical background in the energy sector. And we're looking for technical PMs to work on our data platform. And I would say, like, overall, what I specifically look for is strategic thinking, ability to collaborate with other stakeholders, and the ability to listen and not get frustrated, particularly because it is kind of a slow moving sector. I also think there's a fine line in what leadership qualities really means. I don't like it when that's kind of a box because people can exhibit it in very different ways. I think particularly as a PM, you need to be able to lead a team without necessarily being anyone's direct manager. And that's it's kind of a very tricky skill to hone. And so, obviously you can't always get all of that out of an interview, but that's what I specifically ask questions for. And then, finally for me, I am really interested in what drives people. What have you taken jobs that interest you? Does your resume reflect that? Do you like what you do, and why do you like what you do? I think, I certainly realize that comes from the advice I got when I started in the climate field of take the job that interests you the most. Don't worry about what it pays. And that's, it's worked out and paid off for me. I understand it's not the only way to get somewhere, but if I can hear from people who are generally interested in have that drive to understand better, to understand like why they are working in the field they're working in. If they're super excited about that, then that's a check for the curiosity box for me.
That's amazing. And with people there, I'm sure there are people here who do not come from a technical background. Mm-hmm. Could you share, maybe kind of reflecting back, what do you think are the strengths of PMs coming from non-technical backgrounds, And how did that help you in your job, or like in your jobs?
Yeah, definitely. So I think for me, coming from a policy background meant I was always working with different stakeholders to understand their needs, their priorities, their requirements, why they're pursuing the questions they're pursuing. And that's proven really helpful in a PM role. Right now, I'm kind of dealing with the same thing, having to understand where the customer is coming from, aligning BD with our product strategy, working with our dev team to kind of define requirements, unblock issues. Just being able to work with all of those very different stakeholders is definitely challenging. And like I said before, I'm not anyone's boss. I can tell them what to do technically, but mostly I have to make sure that the interdisciplinary team I've built is motivated to do something because they want to help make the company successful. I'm also I think also communication skills to that end is really important, both written and verbal, particularly in distributed workforces like we are now. We need to be communicating concisely in meetings, having clear written documentation, and being able to move teams forward that way is important. And you're really getting to the why in your user requirement. And then I think just deep interest in the topic, because this field is frustrating. You need to be really driven by a desire to work in the climate field. It really isn't for everybody. I think there's a space in it for everybody, but the pace of change is going to be slow. We need it to be a lot quicker, and that's why I want more people to work in it. But you can't get frustrated by having no sales in Q1 or something. It's just not really, for us, it's really not that kind of industry where I work in this space, at least.
So you've kind of highlighted a few skills, for example, understanding the stakeholders, communication, written, verbal, but also sort of strategic insights, because you've studied it from a non-product perspective. Perhaps kind of from the other side, were there any experiences coming from the public policy journey that helped you in your product management and your PM role right now?
Yeah, definitely. I think with public policy, with my public policy skills, I developed pretty good subject matter expertise that it would have been hard to pick up in other places. You definitely always can through just reading and keeping updated. It is a really kind of fast-paced environment, similar to the policy realm, and it requires you to kind of context switch quite a lot of the time. And I think that is definitely very important if you're in an organization that is product driven, because we are that kind of company. I find myself getting pulled into a lot of meetings that I'm tangentially related to, right? I should be consulted or informed, but because there's just a lot going on, on days when you have 8 hours of meetings, you just have to be able to switch context quickly and still provide the input that people are relying on you to input. And then I think finally the last transferable skill is probably knowing how to ask the right questions. There are we could go all day, I think, kind of talking about problems with our stakeholders, to get them to kind of talk about what are the potential solutions they would like to see. It does require you to kind of make sure you're asking the right questions. Same when you're working internally with a development team. And that, I think, you really hone in the policy realm.
Awesome. Now we'll go on to some Q&A. So we've pre-collected some questions from people who registered.
Okay, so Iris is probably going to join us again. So awesome, we've collected some questions and we've got some questions from the registration form, but we've also got questions from the chat. And so if Nancy Wang is here, I'm just going to see the list. No, she's not present. I'm going to go through the questions so people who are here can at least ask them. So Richard Kim in the registration, he asks in the registration form, he asks, what are the main challenges that you've had in transitioning to a PM role, and what surprised you in doing so?
Yeah, honestly, main challenge for me was probably imposter syndrome. I think in any role, when you're working with people who are experts in their field or have a technical skill set you don't, for me, I had a lot of imposter syndrome, kind of questioning like, am I asking the right questions? Am I thinking about this the right way? And, you do get over that with time and just, talking to folks, speaking up when you don't know something. And luckily I have a really supportive team. And so that transition was, they made that transition really easy on me. Candidly as well, I think in the energy sector and in the tech sector, there's kind of there's a dearth of women who work in this space. Particularly if you've ever been to a meeting with any utility executives, it's always, older white men. And with kind of energy, the intersection of energy and technology, you're kind of getting that double whammy of, fewer women in tech, fewer women in energy, and it is what it is. But that as well adds a little bit to my imposter syndrome.
For sure.
Yeah, and I think luckily in this day and age, there are a lot of ways that just imposter syndrome that comes with not knowing or not having that technical background can be mitigated. I had, luckily a supportive, I work at a supportive company that allowed me to go take courses in product management and paid for that tuition. Absent getting that tuition reimbursement, I probably still would have done it anyways. It's and it's investment in yourself. So I'm very happy to have done it.
Yeah, that is awesome to hear. So next question is coming from Julia. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? If not, I can ask it as well.
That's good. So I wrote, it seems like a major barrier in modernizing the grid with DERs is the lack of political willpower to enable those changes. Like, for example, the need for more incentives for demand side management techniques or more regulation of investor-owned utilities for just a more competitive marketplace. Mm-hmm. And while I think this is true, it sounds like a somewhat oversimplification of the problem just to blame it on political willpower. But that's what I've commonly heard or read. So wondering what you think is the main challenge, or if there's a little bit more nuance in this area.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think for me, the nuance I've seen is there is we need to change how the folks who are closely planning for and operating the resources understand how to plan for and value those resources. We treat a lot of DER right now as part of the problem, to be frank, right? Like when we talk about solar, we are always kind of talking about the duck curve or lack of hosting capacity, space on the distribution grid, cost to upgrade to accommodate more solar. And a lot of that does come down to the way we plan for and forecast those resources. Because the folks dealing with planning are dealing with more unknowns than they are knowns, they are going to err on the side of caution. And that's their role. Utilities are tasked with keeping the lights on. And if they, the best way for them to mitigate that uncertainty is to be more conservative in that way. A lot of utilities have made a lot of progress. There are really interesting, programs coming out. But at the end of the day, there needs to be enough proof in the technology and ability for them to make those very large strategic decisions they're making. And, honestly, with a regulated utility, it's both keeping the lights on and maintaining their rate of return. It's a very complex question for them to kind of answer. And so we're hoping to kind of, for Kevala, we're hoping to kind of develop the platform that helps them make those decisions.
We've also, sorry, Julie, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Amazing. We've also got Richard Kim asking a second question, but since he submitted this in the chat, he can probably unmute himself and ask it himself.
Hi, Laura, thanks so much for your talk. It's great, just great stuff, and really appreciate your coming here and sharing all your knowledge and ideas. It's a little bit of a leading question, I guess, so please feel free to contradict me if I'm wrong here. But just kind of zooming out a bit, it seems like the climate crisis, at least in the US, is analyzed through sort of two different lenses, at least, probably many more. But one is sort of like, let's innovate everywhere. Let's just try to solve all the problems that are out there because we need to get to net zero eventually. The other is, I think, let's electrify and move the grid into the next century as fast as possible because those are our quickest gains. And I'm curious about, do you see your work at Kevala as fitting into that second narrative? And I maybe more broadly, how do you see DERs and energy in general as one of the more or less lesser priorities in fighting the climate crisis?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Nice meeting you. I definitely think we kind of fit into that latter. I think there's the role of the electric grid is I hate the word disruption, but I'm going to use it. Right, it is ripe for disruption. It's centuries old technology that, it's a centuries old planned process. Electricity that does need to change, and we also see electrification of both buildings and transportation as being huge impacts to the impacts and opportunities, right? So as buildings electrify and vehicles electrify, we could be moving away from dirtier fossil fuels to potentially cleaner fossil fuels. But we really need to understand what kind of investments we need to make and what impacts that will have on the distribution grid to really be able to do that. And in California, I don't even live in California anymore, but all my examples are California. In California, transportation is 30 or 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So electrifying that and moving away from fossil fuels will be huge. And similar with buildings, I think, I'm probably going to be wrong, but I think natural gas, most natural gas is 10% or so of emissions. And so those are really big pieces of the climate pie that we could potentially solve with electrification. And I also think it's a great place for PM and folks with software backgrounds to play because it's all about kind of balancing and optimizing the system. We think of everything as having a load or generation shape. So hour for hour, the grid needs to perfectly match supply and demand. That means that the way electric vehicles get adopted, where they get adopted, and how their charging behavior looks like could rapidly kind of throw off goals we have for the grid to kind of serve as that new energy highway, essentially. If they charge at night, that's kind of interesting. If they charge at day at the same time as solar, that's kind of interesting. If they charge at 7 p.m., we're like kind of screwed, right? So how do you really manage all of that? And what are the technology solutions to solve that? I think the first part of what you said is personally also really interesting for me, because not all climate change emissions come from energy use. And so there's a lot of innovation that needs to happen on those other sectors as well. And I would love to like volunteer and work a little bit more in those as well, because thinking back to like my need to figure out where I'm most useful in my theory of change, like I don't know if those are being overlooked, emissions from those other sectors, because energy is a pretty like hot area to work in. But both are definitely important though, and I think going back to my own advice to myself, like you should just pick one, like work deep, not depth, not breadth, in that problem.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course.
I personally have a follow-up question to actually Richard's. You mentioned, you're giving the example of, the greenhouse gas emissions from transportation in California, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And if you electrified, the cars, like, they all become, let's say, overnight Teslas, for lack of a better word. Isn't not solving the root problem, where, people were just going to use maybe cars more, and there's also like side effects to that. What are your thoughts to that? Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and that's kind of why it's such an annoyingly complex problem, because you also want people to live closer to transportation hubs or live closer to where they work. Kind of solving that like last mile problem. There's a lot of things that are at play. I think in general we can say like transitioning from gas to electric is probably good, but there are still a lot of places in the United States that don't have the same amount of renewables penetration that California has. And we have to make sure, like at the time we're transitioning vehicles to electric, we're also transitioning our power mix. And that second one is potentially, it's a public policy challenge in a different way, because you're dealing with, natural gas, oil lobbyists, like a lot of interest there. And so kind of an example of like, technology advancement isn't going to solve everything if we can't transition our actual, what we're actually generating power from.
For sure, that's awesome. So just last question to end our Q&A session.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to hear about your advice on, so kind of like going back a little bit, when you joined Kabala, it was only a 9-person startup. And kind of like, how did you decide that this is a startup you want to join? And like any advice on choosing startup, and especially for early career product managers?
Yeah, so I think I've always gravitated towards smaller teams, because I do think I like learning from in a very interdisciplinary fashion, and in working with smaller teams. I never really considered the risk of working at a startup, which is probably not like, I wouldn't give that advice to everybody, but I do think like choosing what sounds exciting to you is important. If I'm being like very candid, I didn't choose a job that paid over 40K until I was like 26. And that's just kind of how the policy world works, right? So I would say like pick what's interesting to you, like think about what their theory of change is, and kind of do that gut check. For me, I think having worked in the policy realm and being like frustrated at how long things were taking, I knew that Kevala was working with the right stakeholders. They they were innovating kind of like shoulder to shoulder with the partners they chose. They were dealing with the right questions. And while they like didn't have the flashiest website, they still don't, and which is fine. They didn't have like a demo on their website or a product they already advertise as being a full SaaS solution. Kind of think about looking past that and really asking yourself, like, are they? Is their does their mission and approach to that problem, does it really resonate with you, and does it feel like the right problem to try to be solving? Of course, I think the climate industry is pretty tight knit, and so asking for recommendations and hearing from other folks with the reputation of the founder and stuff in the space is from other folks is very valuable as well.
Awesome. Yeah.
So go for it.
So thank you, Laura, so much for coming to our session and answering so many great questions from our audience and from us. So we really did learn a lot. And now we'll go on to our networking session. If people have other commitments, they can feel free to leave. But it will basically be kind of like a round circle if everyone want to go and introduce themselves, or if you have more questions for Laura, feel free to do so.
So we're probably going to hot potato and pick someone, and then they can just choose someone else to introduce themselves. So maybe Katie, why don't you start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Laura, thank you so much for speaking. I really found your story interesting, also because I'm a PM who didn't come from a technical background, or at least not technical in the traditional sense. So yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, nice to meet you. And thanks, Maddie and Iris, for organizing. I am a product manager and a lawyer at a small startup. The whole small startup, we all wear multiple hats type of thing. I've just finished my MBA and my law degree last year, and prior to that, I worked as a mining engineer. So very big 180, but
wow.
So definitely not in the climate space before, but have transitioned to this. But yeah, I'm really excited to chat with other PMs and learn, because I feel like there's so much to learn, especially in this space. I work with banks, so also very slow adopters and patience, a lot of patience. Hot potato to Thomas.
Yeah, I'm a rising senior studying computer science, and well, I actually came in as an environmental engineer, but ended up switching. But I'm like super interested in getting into clean tech. I think like throughout college, I haven't necessarily been as involved in like environmental stuff as I thought I would be. So I think full time, I'm really interested in kind of going back to those like interests in sustainability and just learning more about like how we can improve the world. Because I think recently, especially, a lot of tech has like been criticized for not necessarily being good for the world. So yeah, really interested in tech for social impact. I guess Shreya.
Hi guys. So similarly, I'm also a rising senior from the University of Michigan, studying computer science. I think my interest in clean tech is like pretty new. I don't really know what's out there, like what I can go into after college, but I'm definitely interested in like working in that industry full time. And yeah, right now I'm just in a place of like learning as much as I can. And yeah, that's it.
Maybe Julia can go next, I think.
I can only stay for a little bit, but I wanted to stay and meet all of you really interesting people on this call. So a little bit about me. I'm working at Voltus, which works in a very similar space to you, Laura, with Kabala in the DER management in mostly demand response, but also like a software platform for connecting all different types of DERs to wholesale markets, interfacing between customers and utilities. But I'm actually transitioning to being a PM at Facebook, and I'm really interested in working on some data center sustainability questions. But I started in a couple months, so just kind of thinking about this change to being a PM. Previously, I was interning in more of the finance space in VC. And in general, I'm just really, really passionate about the climate tech, specifically clean energy. And I have a podcast where I interview people doing really interesting projects, a lot of entrepreneurs in that realm. So really great to meet all of you doing really great things. I'll pass it to Richard.
Before Richard starts, I just wanted, we should have done this way earlier, but I just wanted to thank Chi for being like an amazing, she just joined us helping organizing this event, and this would not have been possible without her. Sorry, back to you, Richard.
Hi, everyone. I'm Richard Kim. I'm based in New York. I have had backgrounds as a front-end developer and a lawyer and a product manager. Currently, I'm one of the core organizers at Work and Climate, so I'm one of the mysterious people behind the shadows who help run the Work and Climate community. I do want to put in a quick plug for Work and Climate. All of those of you who are exploring clean tech in different ways, there's a lot of resources at our community. If you haven't checked it already, workanClimate.org. Sometimes it's kind of hard to know what is in there. We're more than just a Slack community. There's actually a ton of collected resources and programs. So if you're not aware of those, feel free to look me up on Slack and ask me about them. I'll pass to Chi, I guess.
Hi, so I'm a college student studying environmental science. I have more background like working in the lab of like microbiology and biology in general. But I do have a question. So one of the big things that I studied last semester was that the resilience of the system. So it's the system is more sustainable when it's resilient to like the changes. So it's kind of like stretch the threshold and make the system more sustainable and resilient to changes. But you mentioned in like how you answer in one of the questions, I think is that the transitioning to electrification is kind of like by balancing and optimizing the system. And what I learned is that sometimes optimizing things is not sustainable because it makes the system more vulnerable to changes. Yeah, so I just want to know, like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for utilities, their intent and focus will never be to have the system perfectly balanced. There's always going to be the need to build in some redundancy, some additional capacity to build in resilience. At the same time, we can be planning so that an individual consumer is not, charging when they get home, or they consider and incentivize battery storage. And utilities have an interesting role in being able to do that as well, right? So right now, I don't know if we've necessarily agreed that building a new substation or installing battery storage is one is more resilient than the other. It's all about the metrics you're using to kind of evaluate the two choices. And right now, from a policy context, we evaluate those two in very different ways. I personally think that the way we value storage value is not aligned with the same way we value new infrastructure that the utility builds. So, you know, we do kind of have to have people starting to speak the same language about that.
Does that answer your question, Shu?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Amazing. I know that Laura does have a commitment afterwards, and so I just wanted to thank you so much for making it and sharing your story with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. It was really nice to meet everyone. I would love to stay in touch. I'm in the Work on Climate group, which is also awesome. So thank you, Richard, for putting that together and organizing. And Fatty and Iris, thanks for extending the invite. I think I'm happy to share my email or connect on Slack, whatever folks might find interesting, and happy to always continue chatting.
Absolutely. We'll be sharing an email to everyone who registered with like a link to your LinkedIn, or you can tell us like what you'd like to be mentioned in the email. But we'll definitely send the notes and a link to the recording to everyone who made it and who couldn't make it. But again, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Laura, and thank you everyone for coming to listen to this amazing story.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all.